My name is Sophie Doyle, and I'm 34 years old. At 22, my father told me that pastry wasn't real cooking, and that if I wasn't willing to learn the actual business, meaning the steakhouse chain our family had spent 3 generations building, I shouldn't bother calling myself a Doyle in professional settings anymore. 12 years later, at my brother's grand opening for our family's 30th restaurant location, my father introduced me to a room full of investors as our other daughter, still figuring out what she wants to do with her life. 4 months after that party, with 3 of those 30 locations facing a foodborne illness lawsuit serious enough to threaten the entire chain's survival, the company's board of directors, now including several outside investors my father no longer fully controlled, hired an independent crisis consulting firm to lead the response before the story broke publicly. Nobody in that boardroom, including my father, had any idea that the firm they were hiring belonged to me, or that the same precision he'd once dismissed at a kitchen pass had spent 12 quiet years becoming exactly the expertise his business would eventually, desperately need. Before I tell you what happened when I walked into that emergency meeting, if you've ever had your work dismissed as not real by the people who were supposed to take you seriously first, take a second and subscribe, but only if this actually speaks to something in you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I promise you I understand exactly what it costs to build something real patiently over years, while the people closest to you keep calling it a hobby, a phase, or a nice little detour from whatever they've already decided your life was supposed to look like. Let me take you back to where this all started, because you can't understand what happened in that boardroom without understanding the restaurant, and the family that came before it. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, the younger of 2 children in a family whose entire identity was built around Doyle's Chop House, a steakhouse my grandfather founded in 1968 that had grown, by the time I was born, into a respected 6-location regional chain known across Northeast Ohio for its dry-aged beef and its old-fashioned white tablecloth formality. My father, Patrick Doyle, had taken over daily operations from my grandfather in his late 20s and had spent the following 3 decades expanding the chain methodically, location by location, treating every new opening with the reverence of a man who genuinely believed he was continuing something sacred. My older brother Connor, 4 years my senior, was, from the earliest age I can remember, being groomed explicitly to inherit that legacy. Brought into the kitchens on weekends starting around age 9, taught to break down a full beef primal by the time he was 14, introduced to vendors and longtime staff with the unmistakable pride of a man showing off his successor. I want to give you a specific memory that captures the underlying shape of things, because I think it explains more than any general description could. When I was 11, I baked my first genuinely successful item from scratch, a lemon tart with a pâte sucrée crust I'd taught myself from a library cookbook, working alone in our kitchen on a Saturday afternoon while my father and Connor were at the restaurant handling a busy dinner service. I was so proud of that tart that I wrapped a slice in wax paper and brought it to the restaurant that evening, waiting nervously by the kitchen pass for a break in service so I could show my father my hands. I remember distinctly, slightly shaking with the particular nervous hope only a child brings to showing a parent something they made entirely on their own. He tasted it, standing at the pass in the middle of a ticket rush, and said, distractedly without really looking at me, "That's nice, sweetheart, but this isn't a bakery, this is a steakhouse. Go find your brother, he's breaking down the ribeyes. That's the real work happening tonight." I remember standing there holding the rest of that tart, watching him turn back to the line, the wax paper crinkling slightly in my grip, and understanding, with the particular clarity children sometimes have about things adults think they're too young to notice, that whatever I built with my own 2 hands was always going to be measured against a definition of real work that had been decided before I was ever given the chance to contribute to it. I don't tell you this because I think my father was a cruel man. He wasn't, not fundamentally. He was a man who had inherited a very narrow, very specific definition of what counted as legitimate culinary work, the definition his own father had handed him, built entirely around the discipline of butchery, grilling and classic steakhouse technique, and who had simply never developed the imagination to recognize that a different kind of culinary excellence, one built around precision chemistry and patience rather than fire and knife work, might be just as demanding and just as legitimate.
There's another memory from around that same period that I think matters, because it shows how differently effort was rewarded for each of us long before any of this crisis ever entered the picture. When Connor was 15, he spent an entire summer apprenticing under our grandfather's original head butcher, a gruff, exacting man named Sal who had worked at the original Doyle's location since 1971, learning to break down full beef primals with a precision that, even at 15, was genuinely impressive. My father took him to the annual regional restaurateurs dinner that year specifically to introduce him around as the future of Doyle's, a title Connor wore. Even then, with a kind of easy, inherited confidence I never once saw extended to anything I built. That same summer, I'd spent 6 weeks perfecting a laminated dough technique for croissants, failing repeatedly, learning through careful trial and error exactly how temperature and timing affected gluten development in a way that I'd later realize in my food science coursework required precisely the same kind of disciplined, technical mastery Connor was being celebrated for at that dinner. Nobody took me to any dinner that summer. Nobody introduced me as the future of anything. I baked alone, in our kitchen, teaching myself from library books, building a foundation of technical skill that would, over a decade later, prove directly transferable to the exact kind of precise, methodical investigation that eventually saved my family's entire business, though nobody in that kitchen, watching a 15-year-old fail at croissants for the 6th consecutive weekend, could possibly have imagined that particular outcome. I studied pastry seriously through high school, taking weekend classes at a culinary program in Cleveland that my mother, quietly, without my father's full knowledge, helped fund out of her own modest savings. My mother, I should say clearly, was never as dismissive of my interests as my father was, but she was also, throughout my childhood, someone who had learned, over decades of marriage, to manage her husband's opinions rather than openly challenge them, and her support for me existed mostly in these quiet, unofficial channels rather than in any direct confrontation with my father's stated values. I went on to study food science and culinary arts at Ohio State, with a growing, increasingly specific interest not just in the craft of pastry itself, but in the underlying science of food safety and quality control. The precise, methodical discipline of understanding exactly why a kitchen succeeds or fails at keeping people safe, a discipline that combined, I discovered with real excitement partway through my degree, the exact kind of meticulous, patient attention I'd always brought to a pastry recipe with a genuinely consequential, high-stakes application. The rupture with my father came the summer after I graduated, at 22, when I told him, at a family dinner, that I'd accepted an entry-level position at a national food safety consulting firm based in Columbus rather than coming to work at Doyle's Chop House in the operations management track he'd always assumed I'd eventually join, the same track Connor had been groomed for since childhood. I want to describe that dinner honestly because I've replayed it many times over the years. My father set down his fork, very deliberately, and asked whether I understood that I was walking away from 3 generations of actual family legacy for a desk job checking other people's kitchens. I told him, as calmly as I could manage, that I found genuine excitement in the work, that I believed I could build real expertise in something that mattered. He said, in a tone I still remember with total clarity, "Pastry was never real cooking, Sophie. And now you want to spend your career telling real restaurants how to run their kitchens, without ever having run one yourself. If you're not willing to learn the actual business, I don't know that you should keep calling yourself a Doyle when you're out there doing whatever this is." My mother, across the table, said nothing, the same quiet, practiced nothing she'd perfected over decades of managing my father's temperament rather than confronting it. I want to add one more detail from that same dinner because I think it captures something important about the specific shape of that rupture. Connor, who was there that night too, home for the weekend from the restaurant, said almost nothing during the entire exchange, but as I was leaving, he walked me out to my car and said, quietly, in a rare moment of genuine vulnerability I didn't fully appreciate at the time, "For what it's worth, I don't think Dad's right about the pastry thing. I've eaten what you make. It's not nothing." It wasn't a grand gesture of solidarity, and it didn't stop him from continuing to occupy the exact protected, groomed successor role that had defined our entire childhood. But I've thought about that small comment many times over the years, a quiet crack of decency in an otherwise painful evening, and I think it's part of why, 12 years later, rebuilding a real relationship with him felt possible in a way rebuilding one with my father, at least initially, did not. I want to pause here for a moment, because I know some of you are already recognizing pieces of your own experience in this, a family that defined real work so narrowly that your actual gifts never had room to count. If that's you, drop a comment with the word narrow below. I want you to know I see you, and I understand exactly how disorienting it is to be told by the people who should know you best that the thing you're genuinely excellent at simply doesn't count. Now, back to the story, because the 12 years that followed are the part where I quietly built the exact expertise my family had told me couldn't possibly matter. I took the position in Columbus at 22, working under a rigorous, exacting food safety director named Miriam Osei, who had built her career auditing commercial kitchens across the Midwest, and who became, over the following 3 years, the first person in my professional life to treat my particular combination of skills, pastry-trained precision, genuine scientific curiosity, and an almost obsessive attention to procedural detail, as a coherent, valuable asset rather than a strange detour from a real culinary path. I want to tell you about one specific evening with Miriam because it's the moment I actually understood what I was building, rather than just surviving inside it. I was 23, maybe 7 months into the job, sitting in a cramped conference room at nearly 10 at night, pouring over temperature logs from a client's walk-in cooler that technically met code, but that felt, to me, subtly wrong in a way I couldn't yet articulate. Miriam found me still there, takeout containers stacked at my elbow, and instead of telling me to go home, she pulled up a chair and asked me to walk her through what was bothering me. I explained the pattern, a cooling curve that technically stayed within acceptable limits but that spiked, briefly, in a way that suggested a compressor cycling improperly during peak service hours, a detail so small most auditors would have signed off without a second look. She listened for a long time without interrupting, and then she said something I've carried with me every single day since. Most people who are good at this work are good because they're naturally suspicious of shortcuts. You're good at it because you actually understand, in your hands, what precision costs and what it protects better than most people who've spent their whole careers in commercial kitchens. That's not a strange detour from real cooking, Sophie. That's the exact same discipline, aimed at something with higher stakes. I didn't tell her, that night, the full story of the lemon tart, or the dinner table where my father had told me pastry wasn't real cooking. But I remember driving home that night feeling, for the first time since I'd left Cleveland, like the thing my family had dismissed might eventually become something they simply hadn't yet developed the vocabulary to recognize. I learned, under her mentorship, how to conduct a full HACCP audit, how to trace a foodborne illness outbreak back to its precise point of failure in a supply chain or kitchen workflow, how to read a health inspector's report the way a detective reads a crime scene, understanding not just what had gone wrong, but why the underlying systems had allowed it to happen. I earned my certified professional in food safety credential at 25, and by 27, I'd been promoted to lead auditor for a portfolio of regional restaurant clients across 3 states. I want to tell you about one specific early case, because it's the moment I first understood, with total clarity, exactly how consequential this work actually was, in a way my father's dismissive comment at that dinner table had never allowed me to imagine. At 26, I was assigned to investigate a cluster of norovirus cases traced to a mid-sized restaurant chain in Indiana, work that required me to trace, over 11 exhausting days, the precise chain of events: an ill employee who'd come to work despite symptoms, a hand-washing station that had been quietly out of service for 2 days without anyone reporting it, a specific batch of prepared salad that had sat at an unsafe temperature for 4 hours during a busy Saturday service. I built a complete, documented root cause analysis that not only resolved the outbreak, but fundamentally restructured that chain's entire food safety protocol going forward, protocol that, as far as I know, has prevented further incidents in the 6 years since. I remember calling my mother that week, exhausted and genuinely proud, trying to explain what I'd just accomplished, and hearing her say, warmly but distractedly, "That's wonderful, honey, but have you talked to your father lately? He mentioned Connor's thinking about opening a 7th location." The gap between what I'd just built and what still counted, in my own family's accounting of achievement, remained exactly as wide as it had been the night of that lemon tart. At 29, with Miriam's enthusiastic support and a modest personal loan I'd carefully saved toward for years, I left the Columbus firm to found my own consultancy, Meridian Food Safety Partners, specializing in what had become, by that point, a genuine niche expertise: crisis response and root cause investigation for restaurant groups facing serious foodborne illness incidents, along with proactive systems audits designed to prevent those crises before they happened. I want to be honest about how difficult those first 2 years actually were because I think it matters for understanding exactly what I built before any of this crisis ever entered the picture. I worked out of a small rented office above a dry cleaner in Columbus, took every client call myself, did my own invoicing and scheduling until nearly midnight most nights, and turned down more than once smaller regional gigs that paid well but that I worried might dilute the specific, rigorous reputation I was trying to build from the ground up. I remember one particular February where I drove 4 hours each way to conduct a full audit for a single small restaurant group in West Virginia for a fee that barely covered the gas and the hotel because Miriam had told me, years earlier, that reputation in this industry gets built one meticulous, unglamorous case at a time, long before anyone notices you're building anything at all. That restaurant group, small as it was, became one of my first genuine references, and their recommendation, passed along quietly through industry channels over the following 2 years, brought me 3 larger regional clients I never could have won through marketing alone. I built that firm slowly and carefully over the following 5 years, taking on smaller regional clients at first, building a reputation through careful, meticulous work rather than aggressive marketing, until, by the time I was 33, Meridian had grown into a 12-person firm with a client roster that included several nationally recognized restaurant groups, along with a specific, hard-won reputation in the industry as the firm you called when a crisis had already begun, and you needed someone who could trace the actual truth of what had happened quickly and defensively, rather than someone who would simply tell you what you wanted to hear. I want to be honest with you about something because I think it matters for how the rest of the story lands. Throughout all 12 of those years, I kept a deliberate, careful distance from anything connected to Doyle's Chop House. I attended family holidays. I sent birthday cards. I answered when my mother called, which was often, and I let my father believe, in the vague, distracted way he'd always characterized my career, that I was still doing that food inspector thing, a description that flattened everything I'd built into something that sounded, in his voice, faintly regulatory and entirely unglamorous. I never once mentioned Meridian's actual client roster to him, partly because he never asked with any real curiosity, and partly, I'll admit, because some old, protective instinct in me had learned over the years to keep the two halves of my life carefully separated, the way you keep a wound bandaged, specifically, so you don't have to keep looking at it. Meanwhile, Connor's path unfolded exactly along the track our father had always envisioned. He took over daily operations of Doyle's Chop House at 28, expanded the chain from 6 locations to 18 over the following decade through a combination of careful management and, eventually, a significant capital infusion from an outside private equity partner my father had reluctantly agreed to bring on when the family's own capital could no longer fund the pace of growth Connor wanted to pursue. That partnership, I'd later come to understand through my professional work on the case, had fundamentally changed the governance structure of the company in ways my father, by his own later admission, had never fully appreciated at the time he signed the deal. Introducing, for the first time in the company's 60-year history, outside board members with genuine fiduciary authority over decisions that had previously belonged entirely to the Doyle family's discretion. Let me pause the story here for a moment because I know this backstory section has been dense, and I want to check in with you before we move into the part where everything actually turns. If you've ever built real, substantial expertise in something your family quietly decided didn't count as legitimate work, drop a comment with the word legitimate below, because I think that word, more than any other, captures exactly what was being withheld from me for over a decade. Now, back to the story, because the grand opening of the chain's 30th location, held 18 months ago at a new flagship restaurant in downtown Columbus, is where the specific moment I open the story with actually happened. The 30th location was, by every account, a genuinely significant milestone for the company, and my father, by then 71 and only partially retired from daily involvement, treated the grand opening with the reverence of a man marking the culmination of his life's work. I attended, along with my mother, because Connor had asked me directly, warmly, in one of the genuinely kind gestures he'd extended toward me over the years despite occupying such a different position in the family than I did, and because, despite everything, I still loved my family and still wanted to celebrate a genuine achievement, even one built around a version of legacy that had never had room for me inside it. The event was elegant, well-attended, filled with investors, longtime staff, local dignitaries, and food press, the kind of room where my father, in his element, moved from table to table with the easy, expansive warmth he'd always reserved for the business he considered his true legacy. About an hour into the reception, he brought a small cluster of the company's newer outside investors over to where I was standing near the dessert table, a detail I want you to notice, because even at this event, some old, unconscious instinct had placed me near the pastry rather than anywhere central to the actual business being celebrated. "And this is my daughter, Sophie," he said, with the easy, distracted warmth of a man introducing a minor footnote rather than a central character in his own family story. "She's, still figuring out what she wants to do with her life. Aren't you, sweetheart?" Always been the artistic one. One of the investors, a polished, friendly woman, laughed politely, the reflexive laugh of someone who trusts the speaker and doesn't examine the words too closely, and asked me, kindly, what I was currently doing. I told her simply that I ran a food safety and crisis consulting firm. She nodded, pleasantly, clearly not registering the specific weight of what that actually meant, and the conversation moved on within seconds, exactly the way it always had at every family gathering for the past 12 years. I didn't correct my father that night. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. I was 34 years old, running a 12-person firm with a client roster most people in my industry would recognize immediately, and I still, in that specific moment, standing near the dessert table at my brother's grand opening, felt the exact same small, familiar collapse I'd felt at 11 years old holding a lemon tart nobody had really looked at. Some patterns, I've learned, don't dissolve just because you've built enough success to logically disprove them. They live somewhere deeper than logic, in the same old room where an 11-year-old still waits for her father to actually taste what she made. I drove back to Columbus that night and, I'll admit, cried in my car in my own driveway for longer than I'm entirely comfortable telling you. The specific grief of realizing that 12 years of genuinely excellent, consequential work had changed absolutely nothing about how my own father chose to introduce me to a room full of strangers. I want to pause the story here because I know this is a heavy place to sit, and I want to check in with you before we keep going. If you've ever built something genuinely impressive and still felt, in one careless sentence from someone who should have known better, exactly as small as you did at 11 years old, drop a comment with the word small below. I promise you, I understand exactly how that particular collapse feels, no matter how much success sits on the other side of it. Now, back to the story, because the next 4 months are where everything actually changed, though not in the way any of us expected. About 6 weeks after the grand opening, Doyle's Chop House began experiencing what initially appeared to be an isolated cluster of customer illness complaints at 3 of its newer locations, Columbus, Pittsburgh, and a recently opened Cincinnati site. Reports of gastrointestinal illness following meals that, taken individually, might have been dismissed as unrelated or unverifiable. Over the following 2 months, that cluster grew serious enough that the company's insurance carrier and outside legal counsel became formally involved, and by the time the 4th month arrived, the company was facing what its board understood to be a credible, potentially significant liability exposure, a possible common source foodborne illness event across multiple locations. The kind of crisis that, handled poorly, could trigger not just individual lawsuits but a public health department. Investigations serious enough to threaten the entire chain's operating licenses, and handled well, might still be contained before it became public knowledge at all. I learned about all of this the same way most crisis consulting engagements begin in my industry, not through any personal connection, but through a completely ordinary, professional referral. Meridian's reputation, by that point, had grown specifically strong in exactly this kind of multi-location outbreak investigation, and when Doyle's Chop House's outside counsel began searching for an independent firm capable of leading a defensible, board-level crisis response, my firm's name came up through 2 separate professional recommendations. Before anyone involved in that search process had any reason to connect the name Doyle to the names Sophie or Meridian. I want to describe honestly what happened when my office manager, a sharp, unflappable woman named Denise Kowalski, who handled our new client intake, brought me the initial inquiry. She placed a folder on my desk with the standard preliminary intake information, client name, general nature of the crisis, referral source. And I remember the specific, cold jolt that went through me reading Doyle's Chop House, LLC at the top of that folder, 12 years of carefully maintained professional distance collapsing in the space of about 2 seconds. The same particular vertigo I imagine anyone in this position might recognize. The collision of a life you've built entirely. Separate from your family finally, unexpectedly colliding with it anyway. I sat with that folder for a long time before saying anything to Denise. I want to be honest that my first instinct, genuinely, was to decline the engagement entirely, citing an obvious conflict of interest, and let one of my 2 senior consultants, either of whom was fully capable of leading a case of this complexity, take it instead. But as I sat with the folder longer, reading the preliminary details of what my father's company was actually facing, the scale of the potential exposure, the specific procedural gaps the initial complaint summary suggested, the genuine risk to the 60-year legacy my father had spent his entire life protecting, something in me shifted, quietly, into a different kind of consideration entirely. I called Miriam Osei that evening, my old mentor, now retired but still someone whose judgment I trusted completely, and laid out the situation honestly, the full weight of it, the family history, and the professional conflict both. She listened for a long time without interrupting, and then she said something I've thought about many times since. Sophie, you've spent 12 years building the exact expertise this crisis needs. The question isn't whether you're capable of handling it objectively. I've watched you handle far more emotionally complicated cases than this one with total professional discipline. The question is whether you're willing to let your father finally see what that expertise actually looks like up close, when the stakes are real enough that he can't dismiss it as a hobby anymore. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up, and I made the decision, the following morning, to accept the engagement on the same strict, disclosed, ethically managed terms I'd used for other conflict-adjacent cases in the past, full written disclosure of the family relationship to the board, an independent senior consultant, a sharp, exacting colleague named Marcus Webb, assigned to review every material finding before it was presented, and a clear, contractual understanding that Meridian's findings would follow the evidence wherever it actually led, regardless of what that meant for anyone's reputation, including my father's. If this is resonating with anyone watching who's ever had to decide whether to bring their hard-won expertise into a room that once dismissed it entirely, comment, I'd walk in 2 below, because I think that specific decision, more than anything else, is what actually made the rest of this story possible. Now, back to the story, because the engagement itself took nearly 6 weeks, and the deeper my team went, the clearer a very specific, very fixable picture became. I led a team of 4 Meridian consultants through a comprehensive root cause investigation across all 3 affected locations, and I want to be honest that I approached that investigation with the exact same rigorous, evidence-first discipline I'd apply to any client, refusing, deliberately, to let any personal history shape my conclusions in either direction. Neither softening my findings out of some misplaced loyalty to my father's legacy, nor, and I want to be equally honest about this, temptation, allowing any old resentment to color my conclusions towards something harsher than the evidence actually supported. I want to describe the specific afternoon the pattern first became clear, because it happened in a way that felt almost anticlimactic given everything it eventually became. One of my consultants, a careful, methodical young auditor named Jason Petrov, had been assigned to trace the cold chain records from the regional distribution facility that supplied all 3 affected locations, work that involved cross-referencing thousands of individual temperature log entries against delivery manifests spanning nearly 4 months. He came into my temporary office at the Doyle's corporate headquarters late one evening, tablet in hand, and said, with the particular flat carefulness junior staff use when they're not yet sure whether what they've found is actually significant, I keep seeing the same maintenance ticket number showing up right before each of the flagged delivery windows, but it's marked resolved every single time within an hour, which doesn't match the actual compressor repair history I pulled from the facility's service contractor. I remember the small, cold flicker that went through me at that sentence, the specific recognition of a shape I'd seen many times before in other investigations, but never once expected to see inside my own family's supply chain. We spent the next 5 hours together, cross-referencing every maintenance ticket against the contractor's actual service visit logs, and by midnight, we had a preliminary map showing that a specific refrigeration unit at the distribution facility had been cycling improperly for at least 6 weeks, with facility staff repeatedly marking maintenance tickets as resolved without an actual technician ever having been dispatched, apparently under pressure to keep reported downtime numbers low ahead of a quarterly operations review Connor's team had scheduled with the private equity partners. What that full record revealed, over the following weeks, was a genuinely fixable but genuinely serious systemic failure. The company's rapid expansion under Connor's leadership, funded by the private equity partnership, had outpaced its own internal food safety training infrastructure, leaving several of the newer locations staffed largely with employees who'd received only a compressed, insufficient version of the training protocol that had governed the company's older, more established restaurants for decades. A specific breakdown in cold chain temperature monitoring at the shared regional distribution facility serving all 3 affected locations, combined with inconsistent employee illness reporting policies at the store level, had created exactly the conditions necessary for a common source contamination event, ultimately traced to a specific batch of prepared sauce that had been held at an unsafe temperature during a period of equipment malfunction that nobody had properly documented or escalated. I want to be honest with you about how it felt, sitting in my office late one evening, reviewing the completed root cause analysis for the first time, watching a genuine, serious business crisis resolve itself into a set of documented, specific, entirely correctable failures. It wasn't triumph, not in any simple sense, watching my own family's business revealed to be genuinely vulnerable in ways that could have been prevented. It was something heavier and more complicated, a strange mixture of professional satisfaction at having done the work correctly and real, personal grief at seeing exactly how much strain Connor's ambitious growth had placed on systems nobody, including my father, had thought carefully enough to reinforce as the company scaled, and a quieter, more private grief still at recognizing how easily this same crisis could have gone undetected entirely if the referral chain had led anywhere but to my own particular, hard-won expertise. Marcus Webb's independent review, conducted with no prior knowledge of my personal history with the client beyond the disclosed conflict itself, confirmed every material finding before we finalized the report. This wasn't a daughter's grudge, delivered with old resentment dressed up as analysis. This was a fully documented, independently verified investigation, built entirely from primary source records, temperature logs, staff training documentation, distribution facility maintenance records, employee interview transcripts, cross-checked by a second qualified examiner with zero personal stake in the outcome, the exact rigor my own work had always demanded, regardless of whose name sat at the top of the client file. The formal presentation of our findings was scheduled for an emergency board meeting held on a Tuesday morning in a conference room at Doyle's Chop House's corporate offices, the same modest brick building outside Cleveland where I'd spent childhood weekends occasionally trailing behind Connor while he learned to break down beef primals I was never invited to touch. The engagement letter had gone out, as required, under Meridian Food Safety Partners' name, with my own name, Sophie Doyle, listed clearly as lead consultant, along with the full written disclosure of my family relationship to the client that the board's outside counsel had reviewed and approved before the engagement was finalized. I later learned that this disclosure had been discussed, briefly, at the board level, primarily among the outside investor representatives who now held genuine governance authority within the company. My father, apparently, either hadn't been told directly in advance, or, more likely given what happened next, had simply not registered the significance of Sophie Doyle, Meridian Food Safety Partners, as anything beyond an oddly specific coincidence of shared surnames, the kind of detail a distracted man might glance past without ever connecting it to his own daughter. I walked into that boardroom on the appointed Tuesday morning in a tailored navy suit, laptop bag over my shoulder, and I want to describe honestly what I felt in the 10 seconds before anyone in that room fully recognized me. My father sat near the head of the table, 71 now, still carrying the same broad-shouldered, commanding presence I remembered from childhood, though age had softened it at the edges in ways I hadn't fully registered until I saw him in this particular, formal setting. Connor sat 2 seats down, visibly exhausted in a way that told me, immediately, exactly how much personal strain this crisis had already placed on him over the preceding 4 months. 3 outside board members sat along the far side of the table, along with the company's outside legal counsel, a careful, precise woman named Rita Alvarado, who had personally overseen Meridian's engagement. My father glanced at me as I entered, the same polite, faintly distracted glance he'd have given any outside consultant entering a room he was paying, by that point, a great deal of money to be in, and gestured toward an empty seat without any flicker of recognition. It wasn't until I sat down, opened my laptop, and connected it to the boardroom display, my full name and firm credentials appearing on the introductory slide. Sophie Doyle, CPFS, founder and lead consultant, Meridian Food Safety Partners, that I watched something shift, slowly, across his face. He looked at the slide. He looked at me. And I watched, in real time, 12 years of a story he'd told himself. A story where pastry wasn't real cooking and food safety consulting was that inspector thing, begin to visibly, physically buckle under the weight of actually understanding, for what may have been the first time, exactly what his daughter had spent over a decade quietly becoming. "Sophie," he said, quietly, and the whole room went very still, the outside board members glancing between us with the particular alertness of people realizing they've just walked into something considerably more personal than a standard crisis briefing. I want to pause here, because I know this is the moment you've been waiting for, and I want to describe it honestly rather than dramatically, because the truth of that room was quieter and more meaningful than any scripted confrontation could have been. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make any reference, in that professional setting, to the grand opening or the lemon tart or 12 years of small, accumulated dismissals. I simply said, "Good morning, everyone. I'm here to present the findings of the root cause investigation the board commissioned." And then, with the same measured, evidence-first discipline I'd applied to every stage of this engagement, I proceeded slide by slide to walk the entire board through exactly what my team had found: the training infrastructure gaps, the cold chain monitoring failure, the specific contaminated batch, all of it traced, dated, and documented with a rigor that left no meaningful room for dispute, along with a detailed, actionable remediation plan that Marcus and I had built specifically to address every identified failure point before the situation could escalate further. One of the outside board members, a sharp, precise woman named Elaine Ferris, who represented the private equity partnership's interests, interrupted about 20 minutes into the presentation to ask a pointed question about accountability, specifically whether the falsified maintenance tickets Jason had discovered represented an isolated incident or a broader cultural problem within the facilities operations team. I answered honestly, exactly as the evidence supported, that our investigation had found a specific pattern of pressure originating from operational metrics tied to the quarterly review process that had incentivized facility staff to underreport equipment downtime, and that any full remediation plan needed to address that underlying incentive structure directly, not just the mechanical failure itself. I watched Connor's face during that specific exchange, and I want to be honest that I saw real discomfort there. The particular discomfort of a man realizing that a growth strategy he genuinely believed was sound had created pressures at the ground level he'd never fully anticipated or examined. My father spoke for the first time about 30 minutes into the presentation, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it in a business setting. "I don't understand how this happened," he said, not defensively, but with a kind of genuine, searching confusion. "We've always run a tight operation." My father ran a tight operation. I told him, as gently as the moment allowed while still being fully honest, that the operation he remembered had been built for 6 locations run almost entirely under his own direct daily oversight, and that scaling to 30 locations across multiple states through a rapid, capital-funded expansion required an entirely different kind of systemic infrastructure than the one the company had originally been built around. Infrastructure that nobody, including the outside investors who'd funded the growth, had fully built out alongside the expansion itself. It wasn't an accusation. It was simply the evidence, laid out plainly, the same way I'd have explained it to any client's board, family connection or not. I watched my father's face throughout that presentation, and I want to be honest that I expected, on some old, familiar level, for him to interrupt, to challenge the findings, to defend the business the way he'd once defended it against my choice to leave it entirely. What actually happened was quieter, and in some ways more moving to witness, because I watched a man who had spent his entire adult life believing pastry work was somehow lesser than steakhouse work sit through 45 minutes of precisely the kind of meticulous, patient, high-stakes technical expertise he'd once dismissed at a kitchen pass, watching it, in real time, save the legacy he'd spent his whole life protecting.
I
Want to be honest that grief and old resentment are not the same thing, though they can sometimes feel identical in the moment, and I want to be equally honest that some part of what I felt in that boardroom, watching my father's face change, was not pure vindication but something more complicated, a strange, layered mixture of relief, old hurt finally being witnessed, and a genuine, unexpected tenderness toward a man I had spent 12 years believing I no longer needed anything from. I don't think those feelings resolved neatly that day, and I don't think they've resolved neatly since. I think they simply became easier to hold, once the actual evidence of what I'd built was finally sitting on a screen in front of the one person whose opinion had shaped, for better and for worse, so much of how I'd measured my own worth for most of my life. Let me pause the story here because I know some of you are wondering what happened after the presentation ended, and I promise we're getting there. But I want you to sit with this moment first. This one quiet, unremarkable sentence, Sophie said quietly in a boardroom, over a slide with my name on it. If you've ever watched someone finally, silently understand exactly what they'd spent years failing to see in you, comment finally below. I understand exactly how complicated that specific kind of vindication can feel. Not loud, not triumphant, just quiet and overdue. Now, back to the story, because what happened after that boardroom presentation is the part one think matters most. The board formally adopted Meridian's remediation plan that same afternoon, and I stayed on, at the board's explicit request, to lead the 6-week implementation process across all 30 locations, rebuilding the training infrastructure, installing proper cold chain monitoring systems at the regional distribution facility, and establishing the kind of consistent, company-wide food safety protocol that should have scaled alongside the chain's rapid growth years earlier. Connor, to his genuine credit, threw himself into that implementation process with real humility, asking better questions in 6 weeks than I believe he'd asked me directly in the preceding 12 years, genuinely curious, for what felt like the first time, about the actual substance of the expertise I'd built. My father asked to speak with me privately after that first boardroom meeting, once the other board members had filed out. We stood in his old office, a room that still smelled faintly of the same cedar and coffee I remembered from childhood visits, and he was quieter than I'd ever seen him, turning a company pen slowly in his hands for a long time before he spoke, the same nervous, unfamiliar gesture I imagine a lot of us have watched a once unshakable parent make, right before they finally say the thing they've been avoiding for years. "I've been thinking about that lemon tart," he said, and I felt something catch in my chest, hearing him name it directly, unprompted, after 23 years. I don't know why I remember it so clearly, but I do. I think about the way I brushed you off that night, and I think about tonight, watching you stand up there and explain, in more detail than I've ever understood about my own restaurants, exactly how to keep people safe. I don't have a good excuse for the years in between. He looked up at me, and for the first time in my life, I watched my father actually struggle to find words instead of reaching for the easy dismissal that had always let him off the hook. "I don't know how to undo 12 years of telling you your work wasn't real," he said. "But I'd like to try understanding it now, if you'll let me." It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't undo the lemon tart, or the grand opening, or a decade of quiet, accumulated smallness. But it was the first time in my life my father had said something to me that wasn't wrapped in dismissal or distraction, and I found, standing in that office, that I could actually let myself believe he meant it, even if I wasn't ready yet to fully trust what came next. I want to tell you about my mother's reaction to all of this, because I think it deserves its own honest accounting, separate from my father's. She called me the evening after that first boardroom presentation, and I want to be honest that her first words weren't quite an apology either, though they carried a different weight than my father's careful office conversation. "I always knew," she said, her voice thick in a way I rarely heard from her. "I knew what you were building, even when I couldn't say it out loud at that table. I used to tell my sister about the cases you'd mentioned on the phone, the outbreaks you traced, and she'd ask why your father never talked about it, and I never had a good answer for her. I sat with that for a long moment, turning over 12 years of a quiet complicity I'd never fully named before, a mother who understood, privately, exactly what I was building, but who had never once found the words or the courage to say so directly at the dinner table where it might have actually mattered. I told her, honestly, that I appreciated her call, but that I needed her to understand something too, that knowing something privately and never saying it aloud for over a decade was its own kind of cost, even if it came from a gentler place than my father's outright dismissal. She was quiet for a long time after that, and then she said, simply, "You're right. I'm sorry it took a crisis for me to finally say it in a room where it counted. I've chosen to accept that as a genuine, if overdue, beginning. I want to tell you honestly what I did with the rest of this engagement because I think it matters more than the confrontation did. I completed the 6-week implementation exactly as I would have for any client, with the same rigor and the same professional standards, and I declined, when the board later offered, to take on any ongoing advisory role beyond the engagement's original scope, both for continued ethical clarity and because, frankly, I understood, by that point, that the healthiest version of my relationship with this family's business required a real, deliberate boundary rather than an ongoing entanglement. The 3 affected locations settled their liability exposure through the company's insurance carrier, with the documented remediation plan serving as clear evidence of good faith, thorough corrective action, and the broader crisis was, by every measure available to me since, successfully contained before it ever became the kind of public story that might have threatened the chain's 60-year legacy. Connor and I talk more now than we ever have, real conversations, not just the polite, surface-level exchanges that had defined our relationship for most of our adult lives. He called me a few months after the engagement ended and asked, genuinely, whether I'd be willing to consult with him informally, outside any formal contract, on a new training program he wanted to build company-wide, something proactive rather than crisis-driven this time. I said yes, and I've found, in the months since, that working alongside my brother as an equal, rather than watching him occupy a role I was never invited to share, has become one of the most unexpectedly healing outcomes of this entire ordeal. I want to describe one specific working session with Connor because I think it captures something important about how our relationship has actually changed, beyond the general warmth of "we talk more now." About 4 months after the engagement, we sat together at his kitchen table, laptops open, mapping out the new training curriculum location by location, and at one point, reviewing a module on cold chain monitoring, he stopped and said quietly, "I used to think what you did was basically glorified paperwork. I genuinely didn't understand, until I watched you trace that compressor failure back through 6 weeks of falsified tickets, that this was actual detective work, with actual consequences if you got it wrong." I told him, honestly, that I'd spent 12 years wishing someone in our family would say exactly that sentence, and that hearing it now, even this late, mattered more than he probably realized. He nodded and we kept working, and I remember thinking, driving home that night, that this quiet, unglamorous kitchen table collaboration was worth more to me than any formal apology could have been, not because it erased the years before it, but because it finally actually treated my expertise as something worth building alongside, rather than something to be managed or dismissed. My relationship with my father remains a careful, ongoing work in progress, the way most relationships built on decades of one-sided dismissal tend to be. He calls more now. He asks better questions about my actual work, and last month at a family dinner, he introduced me to a visiting cousin, not as the artistic one, still figuring things out, but as my daughter, who runs one of the most respected food safety firms in the country and probably saved this whole business 4 months ago. A description so different from the one at that grand opening that I had to excuse myself briefly to the kitchen, not out of anger this time, but out of an overwhelming, complicated relief I hadn't fully expected to feel. I still run Meridian Food Safety Partners, now a 15-person firm with a client roster that has, if anything, grown more prestigious in the 2 years since the Doyle's Chop House engagement quietly became one of the most sensitive and successful cases in my firm's history, a case I still, out of continued professional discretion, don't discuss by name with anyone outside my closest colleagues. I keep, on my office shelf, a small, careful sketch of that original lemon tart, drawn from memory a few years ago on a difficult night when I needed to remind myself why I'd built any of this in the first place, next to my certified professional in food safety credential in its plain frame. It's not a triumphant display. It's a private reminder, for me alone, of exactly how far the distance runs between an 11-year-old standing at a kitchen pass holding a tart nobody really tasted and a boardroom, decades later, where the same exacting, patient precision finally, unmistakably, got to matter. I think, often, about that 11-year-old, standing at the pass with her wax paper wrap slice, and about all the years between her and the woman who eventually walked into that emergency boardroom with a laptop full of documented findings instead of a dessert nobody asked to taste. I don't know that I would have believed, on that Saturday afternoon so long ago, that the same patient, careful attention I brought to a pâte sucrée crust would eventually trace a falsified maintenance ticket back through 6 weeks of quietly mounting risk, or that the precision my father dismissed as not real cooking would become the exact skill that kept his life's work from collapsing under a lawsuit it might never have survived. I think that's the part of this story I've come to value most, more than the apology, more than the boardroom vindication itself. The simple, hard-won proof that the thing you're told doesn't count, if you keep building it carefully enough, for long enough, eventually finds the room where it counts more than anything else in the building. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. The people who decide, early and often, that your particular kind of excellence doesn't count as real work are rarely making an honest assessment of your actual capability. They are usually describing the narrow boundaries of what they were taught to value and mistaking those boundaries for some universal truth about what legitimate achievement looks like. I spent 12 years being quietly dismissed by a family that measured worth almost entirely in fire, knives, and dry-aged beef, building an entirely different kind of expertise in precision, chemistry, and patient methodical care, the exact qualities. It turned out that a genuine crisis eventually needed more than anything else that family had ever known how to value. I want to leave you with one last thought, because I think it matters more than any single detail of the boardroom itself. For 12 years, I let my family believe my work was a hobby, a detour, a phase I might eventually grow out of, and I want to be honest that there were nights during those years when their dismissal nearly convinced me too, when I wondered whether I'd chosen a path that would only ever be legible to strangers and never to the people whose recognition I'd wanted most since I was 11 years old. What kept me building anyway wasn't certainty that vindication was coming. I had no way of knowing, for most of those 12 years, that any crisis would ever arrive to finally make my expertise impossible to dismiss. What kept me building was simply the work itself, one careful audit at a time, one traced outbreak at a time, because I discovered, somewhere in that first year with Miriam, that the work mattered to me on its own terms, entirely independent of whether my father ever came around to seeing it the same way. I think that's the part of this whole experience I'd most want anyone watching, sitting in their own version of that kitchen with a dessert nobody's tasting yet, to actually take with them. You don't need your family's applause to become excellent at something they don't yet understand. Sometimes the truest kind of vindication isn't about the moment they finally see what you built. It's about the 12 years before that moment, when you kept building it anyway, quietly, patiently, entirely on its own merits, long before anyone else was forced to finally admit it had been real and valuable and worth taking seriously the entire time. Thank you for staying with me through this one, all the way to the end. If any part of this reminded you of your own family, your own quiet years of building something real while somebody else called it a hobby, or your own 11-year-old self still waiting for someone to actually taste what you made, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, about underestimated expertise, about patient boundaries, about the specific, quiet kind of justice that finally arrives when a crisis needs exactly the skill everyone once dismissed, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and I'll see you in the next one.